Welcome to Lesson 8 in Unit 21, From Sun to Food. In the previous lesson, students figured out that plants are important to us because they give us food, energy, and oxygen. In this lesson, students use paper models of food chains and ecosystems with a focus on a local Missouri wetland ecosystem. Students figure out that energy flows in one direction through a food chain from the sun all the way to consumers. Our food has energy in it that we use to move and grow. There are different roles in an ecosystem, and living things rearrange the matter they take in and make it into their own form of matter. This lesson is approximately 4 days. In the engage portion of this lesson, students will turn and talk to consider where they get the energy that they need to grow and survive, and what helps them grow larger. Discuss these student ideas as a class. In the Explore portion of this lesson, chart student responses to the topics shown here. Students should think about where the ingredients to make a pizza come from. If no one mentions that the sun is the source of all energy needed to grow crops such as wheat and tomato, be sure to note that here. Similarly, cows need to eat grass in order to produce cheese that is used on pizza. If students are unsure, it is okay at this point. They will develop these ideas further as the unit progresses. Next, have students turn to the energy diagram for pizza activity on page 18 of their science journals. Introduce students to the vocabulary words consumer, decomposer, carnivore, producer, omnivore, and herbivore. Students should fill in the words with your guidance. Use teacher page 16, shown here, to direct student thinking about these new vocabulary words. Guide students to work in groups to add arrows to their diagram showing the flow of energy. Now they can trace the path of energy from the sun to Carlos using several routes. After students have completed this diagram, discuss which route has the fewest steps and which has the most steps. Ask, what might this have to do with our design challenge? Accept any answers at this time. Students will research this idea more in depth during Lesson 10. In the Explain portion of this lesson, students will watch an informative video and discuss a book reading. First, explain to students that a food chain describes the path that energy takes to get from the sun to the final consumer. On the pizza diagram, one food chain is sun to grass to chicken to Carlos, who eats the pizza at the end. Another food chain is the sun to tomatoes to Carlos. At each step of a food chain, some energy is lost to the environment as waste. Watch the following video from PBS Learning Media, Food Chain. After watching the video, ask students to answer the last 2 questions on student page 18. You may want to allow them to think, pair, share. Next, read and discuss the book, Pass the Energy Please. Use the Read Aloud Guide on teacher pages 17 and 18 for help facilitating a productive conversation about food chains. As you read the book together, the class will attempt to label producers, consumers, herbivores, and carnivores. Teachers, you will stop reading on page 23. Pages 24 through 30 will be read during Lesson 9. You may want to ask students to turn and talk to summarize the text thus far. The main ideas should include the following. Plants take energy from the sun, which allows them to make their own food. Each time an animal consumes a plant or other animal, there is energy passed on to the consumer. Each type of organism is well suited to its particular food source. And finally, we are all linked to each other in an ecosystem. If you would like extra practice for vocabulary, have students complete the I Am What I Eat flowchart on student page 19 of their science journals. Give students a chance to work through the flowchart individually or in pairs. When they think they have finished, Go through the flowchart step by step. Ensure that students are discussing each result and correcting any mistakes that they may have made. The answer key for this handout is on teacher page 19. In the elaborate portion of this lesson, students will use the pond posters to create food chains. Tell students, a pond is an example of an ecosystem in Missouri which contains both living and non-living parts. In this ecosystem, the organisms are consuming both living and non-living things, which will cause matter to be cycled and energy to be transferred throughout the ecosystem. Place the students into 6 groups and give each group a copy of the pond poster and the corresponding organism card set. Challenge the students to create food chains based on what the cards say on the back. Review the tutorial for this activity for examples and differentiation options. In this example, students create a simple food chain with energy arrows moving from prey to predator. Next, pose the following discussion questions to students and allow them to discuss in small groups. Then, share out to the whole class using a strategy like discussion diamond or graffiti talk. You could use Missouri Pond Notes on student page 20 for discussion recording purposes. At this point, students should understand that organisms higher on the food chain are getting matter and energy from the organisms that they eat. They should also notice that they use the energy and matter to move, grow, and stay warm. Continue the discussion with the questions, what would happen to this ecosystem if one animal or plant is removed? How would this impact the food chains in the ecosystem? Responses may include that it would affect the other organisms and there would either be more or less of other organisms depending on the organism that was removed. Follow up with the question, which direction is the energy moving? How would you describe how the energy moves? Students should notice that the energy moves in one direction from the sun to the top-level organisms. Discuss what would happen if there was a drought, flood, or if people decided to build a shopping mall. In any case, certain organisms may not survive in this ecosystems and food chains would be disrupted. Finally, have students look again at the food chain they made with arrows, then add an organism that eats the same type of food as another organism in that food chain. Ask students to draw energy arrows to that new organism they added. Ask students, what would happen to the amount of organisms in your food chain now that this new species has been introduced? In this example, there would be less pond snails because both the frogs and fish would eat them. There might be more algae since there are less snails. There might be less fish because there are less snails, and less snakes because there are less fish. Accept any reasonable answer if students can justify their thinking. For differentiation options, you could have students add another organism, then answer similar questions about the matter and energy relationships. If an omnivore such as a raccoon were added, have students draw arrows to indicate what the raccoon would eat. Remember, the back of the cards have descriptions of what each species would eat. The food chains can be built out even more to include other species. A complex food chain might look like this. Finally, show students this picture of the energy pyramid. You may want to read this section out loud to students or let them read it depending on their reading level comfort. Tell students that an energy pyramid is another way that students model food chains. You could ask students to draw an energy pyramid of a food chain they created with the Missouri Pond cards. Producers should always be at the bottom of the pyramid. In the evaluate portion of this lesson, allow students to refine their own pizza farm model. Students should now be able to show energy arrows in the correct one-way direction from the sun to producers to consumers. Students can also add vocabulary labels such as producer, herbivore, consumer, and omnivore on their pictures. Next, allow students to use their models and think, pair, share. Students should be able to articulate that the energy ultimately comes from the sun and then from the plants and/or animals they eat. The plants capture the energy during photosynthesis. The matter comes from the plants and/or animals they eat. There is an optional extend activity that would be helpful to a range of learners. This is an interactive food web game students can play online. Adobe Flash will be required to run this simulation. In this lesson, students used paper models of food chains with a focus on a local Missouri wetland ecosystem. Students figured out that energy flows in one direction through a food chain from the sun to consumers. Our food has energy in it that we use to move and grow. There are different roles in an ecosystem, and living things rearrange the matter they take in and make it into their own form of matter. By figuring these things out, students will be able to think more deeply about how matter cycles in an ecosystem. This will also help them further refine their pizza farm model and create efficient farm designs in the design challenge.